And now, from the University of Virginia Center for Politics.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm so glad you're here with us tonight. My name is Jim Bacon. I'm Executive Director of the Jefferson Council, and we are pleased to co-sponsor tonight's speech with the UVA Center of Politics, and we thank the Center for all their help in putting on this event. Now, you don't need me to tell you that our guest speaker won the Pulitzer Prize for commentary in 1977, or that he remains today one of America's preeminent conservative columnists, or that he combines keen insight into American politics and culture with an ability to polish words to rhetorical perfection, or that he has stayed steadfast in his principles even as Democrats have descended into madness and Republicans have followed close behind. But George Will is more than a potentate of punditry. What you likely don't know about him is that for all his sharp-elbowed observations, he's a very nice man. Last week, I sat down for dinner with some old friends, as we do every month, and I mentioned that I had the honor of introducing Mr. Will tonight. And two of them proceeded to tell stories about their encounters with him. And by way of preface, let me say that both are ardent Democrats who are very parsimonious with their praise of any conservative. So my friend Sam recounted how back in the 1980s, he and some friends were in Washington, D.C., and he happened to purchase a book that Mr. Will had just written. Apparently, they knew his office was not far away, and so they just got this wild, crazy idea to go get his autograph. And they dropped into his office uninvited. He wasn't there. He was away on a luncheon, but the receptionist suggested they wait. So not long after, Mr. Will came traipsing in the company of Nancy Reagan. And not only did he oblige my friend with an autograph, but he and Mrs. Reagan happily engaged in conversation for 20, 30 minutes. Made a lasting impression that my friend had never forgotten. Another friend of mine, Ken, told us about how he, as a law student, he came across the same George Will column published in two different newspapers. And the headlines, based on the same column, were diametrically opposed. And he wrote, this just struck him as crazy, something wrong with this, so he wrote Mr. Will a letter asking why he didn't insist that newspaper publish the same headlines. And Mr. Will actually wrote back, explaining that that was not the industry practice and he had no control over the matter. Well, my friend, he wrote back with a rejoinder and said, well, you got to do something about it, and Mr. Will obliged him with yet another letter back. So in the days before email, written correspondence like that was extremely rare and really quite remarkable. So that's the kind of man he is. But enough stories about him and his personality. You've come here not to hear about what a delightful person he is, but what he has to say about free speech and its discontents. And hopefully he will say not quite so nicely, maybe he will skewer a few people in the process. Thank you, Mr. Will.
Thank you for that very generous introduction that proves that not all forms of inflation are painful. On a June New York evening in 1976, Senator Jim Buckley, William F. Buckley's brother, won renomination to seek a second term as the senator from New York, and Pat Moynihan won the Democratic nomination. At his headquarters, Jim Buckley said, "I congratulate Professor Moynihan and look forward to running against Professor Moynihan, who I'm sure will conduct the kind of high-level campaign we expect of a Harvard professor." Back at Pat's headquarters, a journalist said, "Pat, Jim is referring to you as Professor Moynihan." Pat drew himself up to his considerable 6'5" height and said, "Ah, the mudslinging has begun." This episode involved two of my friends. Jim Buckley recently celebrated his 100th birthday not far from where I live. Having Pat as a friend was the highlight of my, so far, 53 years in Washington. I have mentioned this Buckley-Moynihan episode as a prelude to a confession. In conformity to the rules of ruthless full disclosure, and in the spirit of today's confessional culture, I herewith acknowledge a dark secret. I once was a college professor. That was before I turned to journalism, or as my father, a college professor, thought, before I sank to journalism. As I ended my 2 years at Oxford, I was undecided as to whether I wanted to become an academic, as my father was, or a lawyer. So I applied to a distinguished law school and to Princeton's philosophy PhD program. I think, it's been a long time, but I think I chose Princeton because it was midway between two National League baseball cities, which gives you an idea of my academic seriousness. But I want to establish a premise for my remarks tonight. I grew up around the campus of a large, great land-grant university, the University of Illinois, where my father taught philosophy for 39 years. I have been privileged to receive degrees from two of the world's most esteemed universities, Oxford and Princeton. And I believe that the great research universities of the Western world are the finest ornaments of Western civilization. They evolved precariously through 800 years of ecclesiastical and political thickets, fending off interference. Their magnificent legacy can, however, be squandered in a generation, destroyed from within, not from without. They can fall under the control of people who are unsympathetic, even hostile to, the university's noble and timeless mission of free and fearless inquiry and disputation. And under the modern tenure system, this caste of hostile people can reproduce itself, reinforcing an authoritarian grip that cannot easily, if at all, be pried loose. It is therefore urgent to think clearly about the intellectual sources of today's anti-intellectual distempers on campuses, and about the strange emergence of a large cohort of young people who are not only fragile and easily frightened, but are unashamedly so, even proudly so, advertising their susceptibility to being triggered by microaggressions and by the trauma of encountering ideas they do not like. Today, I want to acquaint them with two ideas they will not like. I will do so by explaining, in my judgment, today's campus turmoil with two hypotheses. My first hypothesis is that the very idea of an open society is being rejected by people who think that such a society is a naive, even a perverse aspiration. Such people are, whether they know it or not, inhabiting a dangerous, illiberal mental world that began to gain adherents 2 centuries ago. My second hypothesis is that hostility to an open society appeals to people, particularly but not exclusively young people, who are haunted by an exaggerated sense of the harms from which they think they need protection. It is because of my first hypothesis, to which I shall now turn, that such people feel constantly and permanently threatened and justified in not tolerating those whose ideas and speech offend them. So to my first hypothesis. In the late 1940s, when American conservatism began to gain intellectual heft, One of the canonical texts was Richard Weaver's book, Ideas Have Consequences. Indeed, they do. In fact, a long life has taught me that only ideas have large and lasting consequences. Today's tormented academia is the consequence of an idea. The illiberalism permeating campuses and engulfing some of them is a 21st century echo of a 19th century development in political philosophy. This intellectual development was born as an explicit repudiation of the thinking of Thomas Jefferson, and hence of this nation's foundational principle. The repudiated principle was and is the doctrine of natural rights. Jefferson, in the common terminology of his day, said we are endowed by our Creator with these rights. It is not, however, necessary to anchor the idea of natural rights in any theism. Rather, it suffices to say that natural rights are those rights that have been found by long historical experience to be necessary for the flourishing of creatures with our natures. Natural rights define every person's sovereignty. The most neglected word, arguably the most important word, in the Declaration of Independence is secure. Governments, Jefferson wrote, are instituted to secure natural rights. That is, natural rights precede and exist independently of government. As Georgetown law professor Randy Barnett tirelessly insists, first come rights, then comes government. Absent a doctrine of natural rights, rights are mere zones of sovereignty granted to individuals by the grace of government and revocable by government. President Calvin Coolidge, the last president with a constitutional understanding of his office, in my judgment, spoke in Philadelphia during the 1926 celebration of the sesquicentennial of the Declaration of Independence. In his great speech, Coolidge said, "About the Declaration, there is a finality that is exceedingly restful." Coolidge said, "It is often asserted that new ideas have given us great advancements beyond the thinking of America's founders. Not so," said Coolidge. "If all men are created equal," Coolidge said, "that is final. If they are endowed with inalienable rights, that is final. No progress can be made beyond these propositions." But what if there is no such thing as human nature? What if human nature is a fiction, a pre-modern superstition? What if human beings are merely creatures that take whatever shape is imposed by them, whatever impress is left on them by the promptings of the culture in which they are situated? If so, then controlling the culture becomes imperative, and politics must saturate every nook and cranny of life. And this saturation will inevitably mean controlling what people say and hear, read, think, and teach. Shaping the consciousness of the people, purging the people of what Marxists came to call false consciousness, becomes the great, the encompassing, the illimitable political project. Once curating consciousness becomes a political project, the jurisdiction of politics becomes enormous. It becomes universal, and the idea of limited government becomes unintelligible. It disappears. The politics of consciousness, which is what's going on our campuses. The politics of consciousness promises such glittering possibilities that politics must not be circumscribed by any limits on coercion. Particularly any speech, any idea that contributes to false consciousness must not be tolerated, lest progress be delayed. So, censorship is, to the censors, strictly speaking, progressive. It is necessary for progress. And censorship becomes a categorical imperative when the duty to control culture is reinforced by a sense of crisis, or as is now constantly said, existential crisis. For example, the widespread suppression of anti-war speech during Woodrow Wilson's wartime fascism, that is not too strong a label for it, was justified by equating dissent about World War I with treason threatening the nation's very existence. The Red Scare of the Palmer raids immediately after the war were fueled by continuing hysteria. It was the intolerance of dissent during the McCarthyite hysteria of the Cold War. Intolerance and hysteria and a sense of crisis, real or manufactured, go together. Today it is said the existential crisis that justifies censorship is systemic racism or climate change. And of course there will be future justifications of suppression. There always are urgent reasons given for being especially aggressive and repressive about keeping the culture on the right side of history. How many times recently have we heard that phrase, not as a part of an argument, but as an argument-ending assertion? 19th century intellectuals who made fine-tuning everyone's consciousness a political project also decided that history with a capital H, history as a proper noun, is an autonomous thing, unfolding according to its iron laws to which we should conform if we know what's good for us. These intellectuals said that a small clerisy of people like them, people who understand history with a capital H and want to be on the right side of it, should govern. It's a perfectly natural conclusion if you believe the first. The conception of history as an entity with a mind of its own, as something to which intelligent people should defer and conform, we can blame on Marx, or we can blame Hegel for Marx. But the man who was to wield this concept of history as a history-making cudgel was and still is Lenin. He defined the Communist Party as the vanguard of the proletariat. By the vanguard, he meant the clear-sighted, thinking minority. The party would be controlled by a cadre of advanced thinkers who are the repository of true consciousness and who must be diligent about stamping out false consciousness. In today's China, which is a party state, Marx explains nothing. Lenin explains everything. The Leninist temptation, the totalitarian temptation, comes in many flavors and intensities, but it always rests on a denial of human nature. If there is no settled, fixed human nature, if human beings are always and only creatures who are created by the marks made on them by the culture in which they are raised and live, then the stakes of politics are always and everywhere enormous. They are literally everything, including the sort of beings that humans will be. And everything is inevitably politicized. Everything. From work to leisure, what we read, what we eat, how we are entertained, and what is allowed to be said and read and taught and thought. I was watching television the other night and an ad for a grocery chain came on. And they had a picture of a chocolate bar. And they said, this chocolate bar is raised in conformity with some UN thing. And fair trade coffee, if you're going to drink coffee with your chocolate bar. He went down a list where everything the grocery store did was a political affirmation. It is like living in East Germany. Remember the first, if I could digress, I remember when first I went to Moscow, and what struck me as awful was the absence of advertising at night. Because there was only one opinion to be had, which was socialism makes you free, et cetera, et cetera. And it was ubiquitous and unavoidable, and one longed for an advertisement for radial tires, something, anything. But that was a part of false consciousness. Ultimately, this idea, the absence of a true human nature, the plasticity and malleability of the human raw material that politics works on, this idea is the source of totalitarianism, the totalizing of politics. Leon Trotsky understood this. He embraced Lenin's dictatorship of the proletariat, which he was certain would produce wonderful results. Trotsky concluded his 1924 book, Literature and Revolution, with an ecstatic paean to a shimmering future. He said that under communism, and I'm quoting him here, man will become immeasurably stronger, wiser, and subtler. His body will become more harmonized, his movements more rhythmic, his voice more musical. The forms of life will become dynamically dramatic. The average human type, Trotsky said, will rise to the heights of an Aristotle, a Goethe, or a Marx. Well, Trotsky's auto-intoxication was laughable, but not funny. Scores of millions of people have died at the hands of people possessed, as Trotsky was, by the belief that human beings are mere creatures of the culture and hence are plastic to the firm touch of politics. Again, the root of this evil is the idea that human beings are infinitely malleable because there is no human nature, that human beings are whatever the culture molds them to be, and therefore the political project to which everything must defer is to control the culture. People who believe this will naturally believe that politics can and has a duty to shape the culture unimpeded by any limits on the power of the state. And they will believe that censorship, the minute regulation of speech, must be the foundation of the state. For people who believe, as Trotsky did, that the mission of politics is godlike, who believe that infinite progress is possible by pounding the public's consciousness into a new shape congruent with the unfolding of history. For people who believe this, no amount of coercion is unthinkable. In fact, censorship and other coercions in the name of idealistic intolerance are a duty. Which brings me to my second hypothesis, which is this. People who believe that culture determines the nature of everyone and everything, and who believe, therefore, that politics must control culture, everything that is said and read and thought and taught, such people will necessarily believe that they are directly harmed by any speech and all ideas that retard progress as they understand progress. So they will have what Jonathan Turley of George Washington University Law School calls a license to silence. Such thinking is incompatible with the principle of an open society as enunciated by John Stuart Mill in his essay on liberty, in which Mill formulated a harm principle. He said, and I quote, "The sole end for which mankind are warranted individually or collectively in interfering with the liberty of action of any of their number is to prevent harm to others. Professor Turley, writing in the Harvard Journal of Law and Public Policy, argues that Mill's harm principle was intended to fend off, to stymie the enemies of free speech. Today, however, in a perverse inversion, the harm principle is being used to empower the enemies of free speech by the following sinister reasoning. They say that everything said or read or written or thought or taught affects the culture, the social system that envelops and shapes everyone situated in it. So, they say, everything affects everyone's interests. So, anyone can claim to be harmed by anything said or read or written or thought or taught. Hence, unfettered discretion, unfettered discussion means that harm is potentially ubiquitous. So everyone's welfare is precarious. Everyone is always in immediate danger of being harmed. Therefore, everyone needs safe spaces in which to shelter while the speech police extinguish harmful speech. This mentality is, of course, the opposite of Jefferson's tolerance regarding something as important as religious differences. As he famously said, "It does me no injury for my neighbor to say there are 20 gods or no God. It neither picks my pocket nor breaks my leg." Jefferson's laconic dismissal of the idea that he is harmed by diversity of opinion contrasts markedly with the prevailing view on campuses today. There, many people, young and not so young, cower and tremble in fear of intellectual pluralism. I will leave it to others to explore the oddity that this is occurring simultaneously with campus diversity bureaucracies sprouting like invasive, fast-growing kudzu. I have 4 children and 8 grandchildren, and I'm curious, if I may digress again. How did we produce young people like this, who are proud of their fragility? I think the key cultural moment was when the noun parent became a verb. I had parents, but they didn't parent me. I think what happened was parent became a verb and parenting became a science. No one who's ever known a child could believe that, but they... And it put an enormous pressure on parents. It used to be you had a baby, you took it home from the hospital and you fed it and sent it to school and raised it. Now you parent it. And you parent it, if you do it right, the implication is this is a skill, semi-scientific. If you do it right, you get perfection. I evidently didn't do it right, but I think an enormous burden descended on young adults when they were told you're a parent and now you're going to parent. And so we got children who were told by their parents, who said, well, I've done it right, therefore you're perfect. Therefore, you must not ever suffer any harm, and any disappointment you suffer or any anxiety is someone's fault, some prompting in the culture, which ought to be corrected. I have returned, obviously, to where I began, to academia. I began my remarks by citing Pat Moynihan's good-natured response to Jim Buckley's good-natured teasing of Pat for being a professor. I will close with an observation. Beginning with the arrival of the Kennedy administration in Washington in 1961, it was said that the Charles River that flows by Harvard now flowed into the Potomac River. Washington was, for a while, enamored of academic luminaries, of whom there were many. Moynihan himself in the 1960s. His Harvard colleagues, John Kenneth Galbraith, the economist, the historian, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., the Rostow brothers and the Bundy brothers, Eric Goldman from Princeton, George Shultz, James Schlesinger, Henry Kissinger, Edward Levy left the presidency of the University of Chicago to become Gerald Ford's Attorney General, and many more. Today is different. There still are academics serving in Washington, but eminent academics are no longer as coveted as they once were for the prestige they once conferred as ornaments in several administrations. Academia has, in fact, squandered its prestige by seeming to adopt an adversarial stance toward American society and toward its traditional values, including those affirmed by the First Amendment, which is first in the Bill of Rights for a reason. Everything, from the pursuit of truth to the pursuit of happiness, depends on freedom of speech and inquiry, especially on campuses. It is especially cherished there by those who espouse ideas that challenge majority orthodoxies. And when challenged, those unchallenged, those orthodoxies become lazy and stale and bullying. So a final word about majorities and majority rule. I grew up in central Illinois, in the Twin Cities of Champaign-Urbana, home of the University of Illinois. According to local lore, it was in the Champaign County Courthouse on a square in Urbana, built of red Indiana limestone. It was in the Champaign County Courthouse in 1854 that a prosperous railroad lawyer from Springfield, Illinois, named Abraham Lincoln, learned that Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas had succeeded in passing the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The act was intended to solve the explosive, nation-rending problem of whether the territories that were not yet states would or would not, could or could not, allow slavery. Douglas's solution, his Solomonic solution to this nation-shattering question, was popular sovereignty in the territories. Let the people of the territories vote. Let them decide, said Douglas. Douglas and the many who supported him said, vote slavery up, vote slavery down. The outcome is, if not a matter of moral indifference, morally secondary. Of primary importance, the Douglas people said, was that the principle of majority rule, the principle that Douglas and many considered the essence of the American project, must prevail. Lincoln's ascent to greatness began with his instant, implacable, and canny opposition to such thinking. America, he said, is not about a process, majority rule. Rather, America is about a condition, liberty. Lincoln did not say, but he could have, that a written constitution is a counter-majoritarian instrument. It circumscribes the power and the sweep of majorities, and hence the power and sweep of politics. The First Amendment says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. No law, no matter how many people might want one. The First Amendment was produced by a Virginian, and I say proudly a Princetonian, indeed Princeton's first graduate student, James Madison. It was written to implement the natural rights philosophy that was given imperishable articulation by the founder of the University of Virginia. So it is altogether fitting and proper that, given impetus by the Jefferson Council, this university can spearhead a nationwide rebirth of freedom, the freedom that matters most, because all others depend upon it, the freedom of speech. for the privilege of speaking here at the Council's invitation. I thank it, and I thank you.
So do you just want to go ahead and you just pick it
Yeah.
up? I'll just leave it up to you.
Sure. Questions? We still on here? Yes, questions. The most important question I'll answer right away. I think the pitch clock in baseball is wonderful, but just,
George, in light of what had happened in the Tennessee House of Representatives recently, I took the liberty of doing a little research and wondering why the gentleman and the lady were revoked their privileges to be part of that body. And I found out that in a lot of circles, the document Robert Rules of Order is a racist document, and the term decorum is also considered a racist word. I didn't know if that you had any, you're the master word.
well, the current Secretary of Transportation says highways are racist. It would be much easier to make a much shorter list of things that aren't. Look, it's become an all-purpose heuristic for describing how you look at the world. And it is possible, I mean, the whole point of the word systemic in the phrase systemic racism is to say that everything's connected to everything else, and that the effects of past acts never stop reverberating. It's like a pebble thrown into a, more likely a boulder thrown into a pond. The ripples never stop. So everything is connected to everything, and everything is tainted. Once you establish that, again, it's an argument that ends arguments because it is theoretically impossible to disprove. It's an unfalsifiable proposition because if you deny it, you are evidence of it. So it's a closed intellectual circle. And this is not the current people in the United States who think that way are. There's a long tradition like this. Lenin said about Kautsky, one of his social democratic rivals, says, why should I argue with Kautsky? I'll say X, he'll say Y, what's the point? It's easier to arrest Kautsky. And it is actually. Disputation is time consuming. Oscar Wilde's definitive, sufficient refutation of socialism was, he says, socialism would take too many evenings, too much politics. And what we've done now, once you say such and such is systemic problem, it means everything's tainted, everything's implicated, nothing is innocent, everything is relevant. And again, it's the totalizing of politics. You can't escape it. And once you accept that frame of argument, you've lost. The other side has won. Because again, as I say, when you dispute it, you are demonstrating, drum roll please, you're demonstrating false consciousness. And you can be dismissed. You're not an interesting, you're not an eligible interlocutor because you do not have proper consciousness. You are crippled. Which is why Lenin, like he said, Marx was right. The proletariat is the engine of history, the progressive force, but it needs our help. It needs the vanguard. That's me, basically, said Lenin, and like-minded people. And we're seeing something like that on campuses. So I say, you're a racist, and you say, no, I'm not. So it's easy. That proves it. It's very hard to have a dialogue.
It's a loop. It's a loop.
Pardon?
It's a loop.
It is a loop. Indeed it is. Sir.
You wrote a marvelous article on the Stanford incident with the Federalist Society. And my opinion, although the law school dean wrote what seemed to be a good response, nothing seemed to happen. The DEI dean is still there; she's still employed. When you see an incident that egregious, if you were the dean, how do you fight this? Do you get a head on a spike and fire? Is that the wrong thing to do?
Well, you do a number of things. First of all, the diversity, equity, inclusion dean has been suspended. She's being paid, but she's probably finished at Stanford. So something has happened. But what you do is, first of all, you take some names. I mean, that was a form of assault. And you have a conversation with the dean of admissions at Stanford. You've got this enormous elite applicant pool. How did they wind up with these people? Seriously, I mean, how did they wind up with people who talk like this? When you read my column, you did not read, because I was talked into taking it out, some of the things they actually shouted at the judge. They said the Washington Post readers don't want to hear this stuff. And I said, they're snowflakes. They need a safe space, and the op-ed page of the Washington Post must be a safe space. But the stuff, I mean, what they shouted, it was irrational, it was abusive. And of course, they said, we're just exercising free speech. Our speech is just louder. So first you change your admission criteria. You try and find out who's, then you encourage judges to, because what all these Stanford students want to do is to become clerks for the appellate judiciary of our Article III courts. Get a few of them to say, as a few of them now have said, we're not taking people from Yale, sorry. We've had it with Yale. We're not having it from Stanford. Then you get Sullivan and Cromwell and Paul Weiss and some of the other major so-called white shoe law firms. Say, we're not going to recruit there for a few years till you sort this out. That will get their attention. The political market has to work. The incentives have to change. Think like Madisonian. Madison's genius was to marshal incentives in a way that protects order and freedom and simultaneously. So there are practical things to be done.
Totally off the subject. You're a great baseball fan.
Yes. Something I know something about at last.
Yeah, well, you are. Will the Nats ever win the series again?
Not in our lifetime. Actually, there's a lot of fluidity in baseball. The country doesn't always get the Yankees against the Dodgers. It's only in politics that we get Biden and Trump over and over again. Baseball is much more fluid. Partly because it's a ruthless meritocracy in a way that our politics is, to say no more, not. So you can go from worst to first pretty fast in baseball. So. Yep. Oh, sorry.
Oh, hi.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for coming. I was wondering, to what extent do you see the issue of ideological intolerance infecting both sides of the political spectrum? And sort of related to that, how would you characterize the fight over critical race theory in the K through 12 system?
This is a hugely difficult issue. Public education is public. It is funded by the government, which has a legitimate interest in seeing that education is not indoctrination. On the other hand, we've had a lot of experience in our history in this country with K through 12 education becoming a political dark and bloody ground. It was after the First World War when in the South more and more young people began going to high school, that parents said, what are they teaching you there? They were teaching Darwin. That's how we got the Scopes trial. Progress, people going to high school, and parents saying, what? And rebelling against it. And before that, we had, in the late 19th century, with immigrants coming, Catholic immigrants, shocking. And we had, because well into the second half of the 19th century, we had an established religion in the United States. It was Protestantism. And it was taught in the schools. They read the Protestant Bible. It just was. First Amendment be damned, we had an established religion. So this is an old American argument. And it's very difficult to formulate the right balance between the difference between preventing indoctrination and allowing free-ranging teaching. First thing you need are non-ideologically inflamed adults to supervise this discussion. And it's not just as bad on the right, but it's bad on the right now as well, partly because the right has said progressives are having all the fun. We want to get into the business of throwing our weight around and using society to do it. I won't mention any names, but the current governor of Florida, who wants to sit in Lincoln's chair, said the other day no one should drink Bud Light. Now, do we want to live in a society where your choice of beer is soggy with politics? I mean, really. That's the society we're coming to. I mean, the brawl-a-day governor took time out from his fight with Mickey Mouse to have this uproar over beer. I probably agree with a whole lot of what he says. But do we really want this to be political at the top of our voice, at the top of our political system? Do we want presidents to do this, a brawl a day? My goodness, it's exhausting. I don't think the American people today are angry. I think they're embarrassed and exhausted. And I think the political market is not working because there's a huge demand for something different, and the demand is not producing supply. And that's a real institutional problem with our candidate selection mechanism.
Hi, thank you for coming. My question is, do you think that technology has exacerbated this problem where no one talks to each other anymore? Because I feel like a lot of people, especially in Congress, and full disclosure, I am a liberal, I'm a pragmatic liberal, but I feel like there's a lot of members of Congress who tweet at each other but don't talk to each other. And it seems like behind closed doors, a lot of members of Congress across the aisle are friends with each other. So do you think technology has exacerbated this problem where no one talks to each other anymore and everything is behind a screen?
Absolutely. I'm in a way the wrong person to talk about this because I do nothing on social media. I'm told I have a Facebook page. I've never seen it. I've never tweeted. Someone, a young person in my office tweets out, what are we up to, 280 characters now? That's a great advantage to some politicians because they can say everything they know, think, and believe in 280 characters. So I don't do that stuff. But nor am I a technological determinist in the sense that I think, well, kids, look at mental health crisis, the sadness, the suicides, the depression that is evidently afflicting a large number of people. I'm a parent determinist. There's a parental failure going on here. But if enough parents fail, then you have a national crisis. Clearly what we've done with the new technologies and the algorithms, we have institutionalized with technology and with the algorithms everybody now inhabits their intellectual silos. So we have institutionalized and made efficient with these technologies confirmation bias. That is, you are exposed to and only to things that confirm your beliefs, which abundant social science indicates makes you believe them all the more ardently, and to be all the more upset when you encounter alternative beliefs. So there's no question that social media, in my judgment, is a net subtraction from American happiness. But we also have to be alert to the fact that democracies, not least ours, are susceptible to recurring moral panics. I'm old enough to remember, because that's all I read at the time were comic books, we had a comic book moral crisis in this country in the late 40s and 50s. I'm terrified of comics. Not as terrified as we were for a while of Elvis Presley, but terrified. Moral panics are so normal in democracies. What's different today is that hysteria has become the default position of Americans. Everything is a crisis. You know, we're a big nation, we're a big problem, so what? I prefer having our problems to the problems any other nation has. We're pretty good at dealing with them. It's messy. A woman just elected a few years ago to the House of Commons in Britain gave what turns out to be her misnamed maiden speech. She said, democracy's like sex. If it isn't messy, you're not doing it right. We ought to bear that in mind because, you know, democracy is turbulent and it's irrational and it's just what it is. But we're pretty good at it. We've only had one real crisis in this country, and it took us 4 years to fight it out, but our institutions cope. I became a columnist in January 1973, the month when the Watergate cover-up began to break. People said, this is a constitutional crisis. No, it wasn't a constitutional crisis. The court stepped in, a tapes decision, separation of powers, executive privilege, we sorted it out. The president left, a new president was sworn in, no tanks in the streets. No, it's not a crisis, it's messy. But it wasn't a crisis. We're pretty good at this. But social media makes people, it's a rage machine. It's a way of generating clicks and attention. And no one generates attention by saying, well, you're sort of right, and I got a point too, and that's not how it works. You get hysteria. And my hope, and it may be the wish being father to the thought, is this will become boring. I think anything's boring after a while. I think the capacity for boredom is one of a human being's great saving graces. Because this, I think after a while, people look at their watch and say, how much longer are we going to do this? And I think the fever is breaking. I may be mistaken, but that would be a first.
I know you used to, first of all, thank you very much for 50 years of writing. I've been reading about that long and have enjoyed them almost all. I know you used to write, it seems to me, a lot more about legal matters, watching the court. I'm curious what you think of the doctrine of stare decisis and if it applied or should have applied to Roe v. Wade or perhaps even Sullivan v. New York.
I still write probably 20% of my columns on legal matters because it's where people have to explain themselves. They have to give reasons. They have to cohere. It's a little oasis in a desert of haranguing. I think stare decisis is important, and I think also that some of the court's finest moments came when it abandoned it. We are very glad, I think, that Brown v. Board of Education did not respect stare decisis of Plessy v. Ferguson. And I think the Dobbs decision was right to overturn what was barely constitutional reasoning in the Roe case. All the Dobbs decision did was say that abortion was a traditional, long before Roe, a traditional part of the police powers of the states, give it back to them. Republicans rejoiced about this, and then they said, uh-oh. Suddenly they became the dog that caught the car. It's going to be hilarious watching this, but stare decisis is important. It is not sacrosanct, and it takes judgment as to when you should overturn and how big a precedent you're overturning. Abortion was a big one, separate but equal is a big one, and there have been others where the court said, oops, in effect, got it wrong. Stunned silence, yes. Wait.
Could you discuss the pending Supreme Court decision on affirmative action and how that may play into a number of the things you've discussed tonight?
Yeah, the court in the America's oldest university and oldest state university, UNC and Harvard, might, although I don't know quite how you write the opinion, might say you cannot use racial considerations in admissions. And if they say that, there will be 2 weeks of the required hysteria in the country. And when the dust settles, they will notice that changed nothing. Universities are going to do what they want to do. They may do it more subtly, they may do it with a guilty conscience, but they're going to do it. They will say, they've already started, you see the movement around the country on the part of universities to abandon standardized tests is preparing the ground for this. Because that prepares the ground for admissions departments to say, we are going to continue, they will say, to admit students based on a holistic examination of the individual. That term was put into the discourse about college admissions by the Supreme Court. I think it was in the Michigan, one of the two Michigan decisions. A holistic evaluation covers a multitude of sins. So I think it's a case worth having. I think it's important for the Supreme Court to say that we ought to be uneasy about and vaguely ashamed about racial distinctions in the allocation of wealth and opportunity in our society, but it won't matter. Other than to say it will give people a kind of cautionary, mild guilty conscience. Also, I mean, there's a real policy problem here. I wrote a column about this when it was still coming out of the New England or whatever circuit it was up there. And I said, if Harvard admitted students solely on the basis of the two so-called objective standards, high school transcripts and standardized tests, it would be 40% Asian and 1% African American. And I sent the column to my friend Drew Faust, who was president of Harvard. She said, where did you get those numbers? I said, I got those numbers from the discovery from the Harvard admissions department. There's one school, there was at the time, a few years ago, it's probably one school in America does that. They admit solely on the basis standardized tests and high school transcripts. It's Caltech, and it's 40% Asian and 1% African American. Now, it will be said, and there's truth to it, that standardized tests, I won't say biased, they're not racist, but there's a cultural effect. John Rawls and other political philosophers have said, look, by the logic of our egalitarian philosophies, the transmission of family advantages is a problem for society. You want a real problem for society? Give me parents who aren't interested in transmitting advantages to their children. But it's a big problem. I take their point. We have this. We just had this so-called racial reckoning after the George Floyd incident. Ruthless honesty about this. Except no one wanted to talk about what everyone knows is the biggest problem. Everyone. And that is that 69% of African American children are born to unmarried mothers. It's not just a racial problem anymore. It's, as Charles Murray has demonstrated in his book Coming Apart, it's class. 10% of the children born out of wedlock are born to college graduate women who are college graduates. 90%. 40% of all first births in the United States, regardless of race, color, creed, national, 40% all first births to unmarried women. A majority of mothers under 30 are not living with the fathers of their children. Now, social science can teach us limited stuff. Pat Moynihan always said, social science can't tell you what to do, it can tell you the results of what you're doing. Abundant social science demonstrates the predictive value of family structure. We had the great Coleman report in the 1960s, after the Second World War. Everyone was agreed, conservatives, liberals, Republicans, that public education ought to be favored. Poured money into it. Class sizes got smaller. Teachers were better paid. Schools were better. Everything improved but test scores. So, Coleman and the biggest social science project in American history produced the Coleman Report, studying secondary education in the United States. And he came to a conclusion so seismic, Pat Moynihan's term for it, that the Johnson administration released the Coleman Report on the Friday of a 4th of July weekend because they did not want it noticed. What he said was, the best predictor of a school's performance on its pupils. Don't talk about class sizes, don't tell me about teachers. It's the number of parents in the home. They said the crucial variables are the amount of homework done in the home, the amount of reading matter in the home, the amount of television watched in the home, days absence from school. It all came down, all correlated with intact families and not. That's it. When Moynihan was a 38-year-old social scientist in Lyndon Johnson's Labor Department in 1965, he prepared a report, now known as the Moynihan Report. Its official title was The Negro Family, The Case for National Action. He had 100 copies published because he knew it would leak eventually, but he wanted to minimize it. Didn't leak for 6 months, which is forever in Washington. In which he said we have a national crisis because 23.7% of African American children are born out of wedlock. 23.7. 69% today. And as I say, it's much more a class problem than a racial problem or this or that ethnicity. How many heard a candid discussion of this during the so-called post-George Floyd racial reckoning? No one talked about it. Pat, for 50 years, was excoriated for blaming the victim. He didn't blame anyone. When it was released, Pat Moynihan said the following. He said, From the wild Irish slums of the East Coast in the 19th century to South Los Angeles today, the lesson of history is clear. When you have a large cohort of adolescent males without fathers in the home, you have chaos. I've raised a bunch of boys, and I know that the whole point of civilization is to civilize adolescent males. That's all we're about. We got about 5 years to do it. That's more than you asked for, but there you are.
Time for one more question.
This is as late in the evening as I've gone without a martini since I was 21. One more question, or I'll let you. Yeah, go ahead.
First of all, thanks for coming. This is fabulous. Would you care to handicap the possibility of the Republican Party coming up with another candidate?
There's no reason why you should know, but you should know that I'm not a Republican. On the morning of June 3rd, 2016, I ceased being a Republican. The night before, my friend Paul Ryan, cheerful, intelligent, spirited, had endorsed the likely Republican nominee, and I said, I'm out of here. But anyway, yeah, look, the country's about to experience something it's never experienced before. Two candidates, the majority of both parties don't want them to run. I think the Democratic Party is in danger of doing something really reckless. Democratic Party is the oldest political party in the world by any measure. It took this country through 2 world wars, a depression, a civil rights era. The greatest political party in the world is doing something shockingly reckless. And the Republican Party barely exists anymore. It's a cult of personality right now. But a majority of Republicans are not, Republicans and independents, almost everyone called an independent isn't. They are behavioral Democrats or behavioral Republicans. It's the way they are. But if you count the behavioral Republicans, a majority don't want Mr. Trump to do this again. There's an enormous amount of talent in the Republican Party in the state houses. I'm against amending the Constitution except for one amendment, Will's amendment. It says simply that you are ineligible to be president of the United States if you are or ever have been a senator, which is really bad training for an executive position. Governors are just good at it. They have to choose. To govern is to choose, they make choices. Senators tweet. That's different. But I think it's possible to hope that someone breaks through. I was going to say, I shouldn't reveal my biases. I'm paid to reveal my biases, so here we go. To me, the ideal outcome would be that Trump and DeSantis blow each other up, and someone like Youngkin or Sununu or Haley or Scott, someone comes through. Because, as I say, the country's not angry, but we're in danger of getting angry candidates. And that's a market failure the country has to address. Thank you very much.